So now we get to talk about the radiographic variables, the things that we can change that affect the image. You guys have gotten to play with some of these, right? KVP and mass, but you haven't gotten to change some other things. Okay, so in subsequent lab experiments, we're going to get to change these other things. Okay, so there's 6 categories for radiographic variables. It gets to be a big long list, which is one of the main reasons why I like giving you the lecture notes. So the first is technical variables. Think of these as radiographic technique or technique selection. It's the things that you go to the control console and you physically change. Okay, you change them between patients or between images. So electrical factors: milliamperage, KVP, or generator type. Which of these 3 can you not change? Yeah, generator type. I'd have to go get a new X-ray generator, right? Or go to a different office, right? And then I can have a different generator. But milliamperage and KVP we do affect. So just real quickly here, what does milliamperage control in the X-ray beam? No. How many X-rays are produced? Alanis, you said something. The quantity. So I heard how many X-rays, I heard quantity of X-rays. Milliamperage controls, ultimately, the quantity of X-rays that are created, how many X-rays in the beam. You can think of that as the intensity of the beam, okay? I like to analogize to flashlights, right? So using flashlight analogies, it's how bright the flashlight is, okay? A brighter flashlight has more intensity, okay? I don't want to look as long at a bright flashlight as I do at a dim flashlight. So then what does KVP control? Kilovoltage. You guys played with this.
The energy that the beam is going to send out.
Yeah, this controls the energy in the beam, right? So, okay, what does that mean to say an X-ray beam has more energy or less energy? What is changing? It's not the speed of the photons because they all travel at light speed.
Penetrating power.
Penetrating power, but what's changing in the physical beam? So, yes, so Parrish said wavelength. Parrish is right, but let's backtrack to what you just said, right? You said the speed of the electrons, right? So let's go all the way back into the X-ray tube, right? I don't know if you guys have seen this. A student built this years ago. It's pretty cool. This is an X-ray tube, okay? A little dusty, but bear with me. You have your filament, right? You have your electron, everyone can see this? You have your electron beam shown as this cone here. That electron beam interacts with an anode surface, and then the X-ray beam travels downward, right? When you adjust KVP, what you're really doing is adjusting how fast the electron cloud moves from cathode to anode, right? You're giving the electrons in the high voltage current, you're giving them more velocity or less velocity, affecting their kinetic energy, okay? Good. When the electrons have more kinetic energy, they can make a more energetic X-ray beam, okay? And if they have less kinetic energy traveling slower, they make a less energetic X-ray beam. So really, what KVP is affecting is the speed of the electrons, but practically what we care about, right, the X-ray beam coming out, it's not affecting how fast they're traveling because X-rays all travel at the same speed of light. So Parrish says wavelength, yeah? So wavelength, so an X-ray beam, an X-ray photon, travels through space, and we can show it like a little wave, okay? Now, the distance from the crest of one wave to the crest of the next, right? And I'm not going to go too far into this right now, but that's the wavelength, how far that is, right? If it's traveling at one set speed, velocity is just c or constant or the speed of light, or 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second or 300 million meters per second, right? That's how fast the X-ray beam travels. If the speed is fixed, right? If the speed is fixed for both of these, they're traveling at equal velocities, the one with shorter wavelength If you stand there in front of it, you will be hit by more waves over the same period of time as you would with the longer wavelength beam. Okay? When you raise kilovoltage, you're shortening the wavelength of the X-ray photons, giving them more energy. Okay? Giving them more energy. Long wavelength, lower energy, short wavelength, higher energy. This is the only difference between photons in the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light has longer wavelength than ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light has longer wavelength than X-rays. Okay, so going from visible light to ultraviolet to X-ray to gamma rays, the wavelength of the photons just shortens up. That's what photons are, by the way, if we haven't made that super duper clear. Photons are a wave in the electromagnetic field. Now, the electromagnetic field part of it might sound a little confusing and hard to understand. Just imagine waves in the ocean, okay? The ocean is equivalent to the field, right? When the ocean is completely flat, that's like the electromagnetic field hanging out in this room right now, okay? Just flat, okay? And as soon as I fire some electrons across that field, right, I vibrate the electromagnetic field, okay? Those vibrations in the field are the X-ray photons, okay? That's why we speed up electrons to begin with. We have to speed them up in order to vibrate the field when we slow them down, okay? Again, it's a lot like waves in the ocean. Okay, that's what KVP does. KVP shortens the wavelength of the X-ray beams, and I forget who said it, but I heard more penetrating power, right? It gives, when the X-ray photons have shorter wavelength, they have more penetrating power. Okay, they have more energy to pass through the body. In flashlight terminology, this is changing the color of the flashlight, you know, from red to blue or something like that, right? It's the color of light is its energy. As in, blue light is more harmful than red light, right? Anybody drive a BMW? No? Nobody drives a Beamer? Really? Oh, man. You guys ever been in one? What are the dash lights colored? Always orange or red. Almost all. I mean, you maybe show me one that's not, but they're always orange or red, okay? They got smart and wanted to reduce eye fatigue in their drivers, so they made their dash lights in an orange or red color because they're lower energy. If you look at like Chevy and Ford and all those other car companies, what are their dash lights colored usually? Blue, right? Blue light is higher energy. Now it's more stimulating to the eye, but it's higher energy and causes more eye fatigue. BMW is smart about it by using the red.
Is that why they have the setting in your phone that can turn off the blue light?
Absolutely, the blue light blocker, right? And when's that good to use? Bedtime, right? Shut off the blue light to your eyes, stop stimulating your brain. By the way, you can't really tell a big difference between the blue light on or off. It's like a small difference, right? But to your brain, that's a huge difference. To your brain, turning off the blue light on your phone is like going from day to night. It's like the sun setting, okay? And it tells your brain, hey man, it's nighttime, right? Start to get those nighttime chemicals going, right? And melatonin and so forth, and help me get to sleep, okay? If you have trouble sleeping, try turning that on your phone. It might help. Also try putting away your phone, but that if you can't do that, turn the blue light blocker on. So, all that said, voltage adjusts the frequency or wavelength, of the X-ray beam. Generator type affects the efficiency, but we don't change that. Okay, but in principle, that changes things. Exposure time. All right, Jesse, what's the deal with exposure time?
Like 5 seconds.
So what is exposure time affecting?
The time between the X-ray tube to the cassette.
Well, let's think about that. X-ray photons travel at one speed, right? Just the speed of light, yeah? So exposure time can't be changing the time that it takes for the X-ray photons to get from the tube to the cassette, because they're always going to travel at the same speed. So when you make an exposure, right, you set a time, yeah? If I make a half-second exposure, leave everything the same, make a half-second exposure, and then make a 1-second exposure. What's the difference between those two?
It's like a 4-second, half-second change.
So what does that change? What am I doing in that half-second or 1 second? What am I creating? All right, Jesse, you can phone a friend. All right, Cynthia.
It's just how much you're exposing the patient.
Yeah. So in that half second or 1 second, when I press expose, what's happening?
Just.
What do you think, Parrish?
Like releasing the X-rays.
Yeah.
For that amount of time.
I'm turning the light on, right? I'm turning the X-ray machine on, okay? Lights off, right? 1,000, okay? 1,000, 1,000. What's the difference between those two exposures?
The amount of light you're getting?
Yeah. I was exposing you to 1 second of light or 2 seconds of light, yeah? When I gave you 2 seconds of light, how much more light did you get than the 1 second exposure? 100% more, right? Twice as much light, yeah? In the 2 seconds of exposure to the light in this room, you got 2 seconds worth of light. In the 1 second exposure, you got only 1 second worth of light, yeah? It's affecting the exposure to the radiation source, right? How long you're exposed to the source of radiation. The X-ray tube, like the light switch on the wall, is only turning on for as long as the exposure time is set for, okay? Exposure time and milliamperage work directly and proportionally with each other, right? If I leave everything the same and I double in exposure time, I'm doubling the amount of radiation the patient is exposed to, doubling the amount of intensity of the beam the patient's exposed to, right? I'm getting twice as many X-rays to the receptor, okay? So exposure time directly affects the image because it affects how long the beam is turned on for, okay? That's why we pair exposure time with milliamperage, because they work directly with each other, and that's why we just have a mass number because of it, right? Most of the time when you're on an X-ray machine, you don't have to go, well, what's my MA, what's my exposure time, right? Here you do, right? Most of the time you just go, well, what's my mass, right? And let me plug in a mass number. So those two together, MA and exposure time, give you the total quantity of X-rays used in an exposure, okay? Again, if I make a 1 second exposure at 100 milliamps, right? That is what? How much mass? 1 second exposure, 100 milliamps. 100 times 1. 100. It's 100 mass, right? Okay. I make a half second exposure at 200 milliamps. It's 100 mass, right? What's the difference in exposure between the two of those? So nothing, right? So what's the difference in exposure? There is no difference in exposure, but the difference between them, right, is one used a short time, one used a long time. The one that used a short time used twice the amount of radiation during that time, right? The one that used a long time used half the amount of radiation during that time. That's why we pair up milliamperage and exposure time with each other. Fantastic. The last two this is one of 6 categories, by the way. The last two technical variables, filtration and field size limitation. Filtration is, what am I putting in the way of the X-ray beam to absorb the low energy, non-diagnostic, useless radiation? Okay. Here's a number for you. Any X-ray machine that's capable of achieving above 70 kVp, so any machine operating above 70 kVp, needs 2.5 millimeters of aluminum filtration, aluminum or aluminum equivalent. Now, what counts as filtration? Anything that gets in the way of the beam counts as filtration. The glass of the tube, the oil in the machine, the collimator box, the mirror that reflects the light that you turn on the mirror that reflects that light down counts as filtration. All of it counts as filtration, as well as any added filtration. Usually a small slab of aluminum is placed in the way. And just like on a cloudy day, your exposure to UV light increases because the low energy rays are absorbed. You can't see the beautiful sun, right? Because the low energy rays, visible light rays, are absorbed by the clouds. The ultraviolet strong rays get through, right? The same thing is true here in the X-ray machine. If we filter out the beam, the low energy radiation is absorbed by the filtration, and the high energy, shorter wavelength stuff makes it through to the image receptor, out of the tube, and becomes part of the primary beam. The word for this is beam hardening. Beam hardening. It's taking the X-ray beam, made of all different energies, and cutting off the low energy stuff. Just don't let it out of the machine. So where's it go? It absorbs into the machine, warms up the equipment. It's part of the waste energy. Lastly, field size limitation. Here's the neat thing about collimation, field size limitation. It's the only technical variable that you can affect. Show me another one, and we can argue about this if you want, but I've looked at this a lot, and it's the only variable that you can affect that improves both the image quality and reduces patient exposure. Every other variable, if it's good for the image, it's usually bad for patient exposure. For example, the use of the table bucky and wall bucky, right? Fantastic for the image, especially with really thick body parts. Reduces scatter, makes the image have better subject contrast, but it increases patient exposure by like 500%, right? Or 600%, 5 to 6 times the amount of exposure. So it's, as far as I've ever been able to tell, it's the only factor that's good for both patient and image. So why not? Why not collimate, right? Makes everything better.